Hello, everybody, and welcome to chapter 38 of the book of Bereishit as we continue to travel through Tanach. Chapter 38 has 30 verses, and it's found in the Koran Sachs Chumash on page 256 and 257. Chapter 38 is a very strange chapter indeed. It interrupts the story of Yosef to focus instead on Yehuda. Yehuda separates from his brothers and marries a Canaanite woman. He has a son, Er, who marries but dies without children. So his other son, Onan, is commanded to perform Yibum with Tamar, but deliberately refuses, and he also dies. Fearing for his youngest son, Shelah, Yehuda sends Tamar away, effectively leaving her trapped, neither married nor free. Seeing that she has been abandoned, Tamar disguises herself and becomes pregnant by Yehuda himself. When she is accused of immorality, Tamar reveals the identifying items Yehuda left with her, at which point Yehuda has to publicly acknowledge his responsibility and the fact that he is the father. Tamar subsequently gives birth to twins, Peretz and Zerach. Peretz becomes the ancestor of King David, which ultimately leads to the Messianic line. To understand this story, we need to first understand what Yibum is. And it's not as strange as it sounds once you start to put some context to it. Yibum was the Torah's answer to a very serious social problem. What should happen to a woman whose husband dies childless, where she has no income, no inheritance, no clear future? Instead, the system of Yibum would say that a death should not erase a person or abandon a widow, and so the closest family member had a responsibility to step in. Yibum sounds strange to us today because we hear it through our modern ears, but it wasn't a romantic system, it was a social safety net. In a world with no welfare, no pensions, and no legal independence for widows, a woman whose husband died childless could simply disappear. Yibum was the system the Torah put in place to say that someone must take responsibility for her, not because they want to, but because it's the right thing to do. And the Torah is realistic. It knows this is uncomfortable, which is why it builds in a dignified opt-out called chalitza. If either side can't commit to this properly, then they wouldn't do it at all. So Yibum isn't about forcing people to be together, it's about refusing to let tragedy leave someone abandoned. And that's why Onan is highlighted here for his inappropriate conduct. And that is why he was subsequently punished. But that's not the only complicated topic that we have to be able to grapple with. We have to understand why it should be that Yehuda would decide to engage in a relationship with someone purporting to be a prostitute. And we also have to understand what it must have taken for Yehuda to admit that he was the father. So this chapter could well throw up more questions for you than answers, and that's okay. That's all part of what we're trying to accomplish here by learning each and every single chapter and each and every single verse. And in fact, I was told quite recently that in the 80s and 90s, there were students in Jewish schools who were taught from a particular edition of the Chumash, which translated verses phrase by phrase. And occasionally, when there were topics which were deemed too sensitive or inappropriate to teach children, they didn't provide the translation at all. And chapter 38 here is one such example. So whereas we might discourage teachers from teaching young children about this episode, we're not going to shy away from it at all. So with that in mind, let's turn together to chapter 38, verse 1. Vayihi ba'is hahi, around that time, around the time that Yosef had now been sold into slavery and the brothers were having to continue with life, Vayered Yehuda me'es achav. Yehuda left his brothers, and it seems there was some disruption to their relationship that caused him to go alone. Vayet ad ish adulami ushmo Chira. And he camped near an Adulami, an Adulamite, named Chira. Verse 2, Vayasham Yehuda bas ish Knaani. Over there Yehuda saw the daughter of a prominent merchant, Ushmo Shua, whose name was Shua, Vaikacheha, Vayavo Eleha. And he married her and he came to her. Verse 3, Vatahar, Vateled Ben. She became pregnant and had a son. Vaikra es Shemo Er. And he called him Er. Verse 4, Vatahar Od, Vateled Ben. She became pregnant again and had a son. Vatikra es Shemo Onan. And she named him Onan. Verse 5, Vatosef Od, Vateled Ben. She had yet another son. Vatikra es Shemo Shelah, and she called him Shelah. Vahaya bechziv belidata oso, and they were in Kaziv when she gave birth to him. Verse 6, Vayikach Yehuda isha le'er b'chora. Yehuda took a wife for his firstborn heir, Ushma Tamar, and her name was Tamar. Verse 7, Vayhi er b'cho Yehuda ra b'einei Adonai. But Yehuda's firstborn, was wicked in Hashem's eyes, Vaymisehu Adonai, and Hashem caused him to die. And our rabbis point out that his wickedness was on account of him violating the commandment of spilling seed. Jewish men are not allowed to spill seed. Having intercourse in the correct way is very important in Judaism. And so it's on account of this that Hashem ends his life. So now we have Tamar, who is a childless widow. So now Onan is going to be encouraged to perform the mitzvah of Yibum, of marrying Tamar in place of his brother, to continue that lineage and to take responsibility for Tamar's future. Verse 8, Vayomer Yehuda le'Onan. Yehuda said to Onan, Bo el eshes achicha v'yabemosa. Come to your brother's wife and fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum for her. Fulfill your duty as her brother-in-law. V'hakein zera le'achiha. Provide children for your brother. Verse 9, Vayeda Onan ki lo yihyeh hazara. But Onan knew that the children would not be considered his. V'haya im ba el eshes achiv. So whenever he came to his brother's wife to be intimate with her, v'shiches artza levilti nasan zera la'achiv. He let his seed go to waste on the ground so as not to have children in his brother's name. Verse 10, Vayera be'einei Adonai asher asa. What he did was wicked in Hashem's eyes. Vayames gamoso. And so Hashem caused him to die also. Verse 11, Vayomer Yehuda l'samar kalaso. Then Yehuda said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, Shavi almana beisavich ad yigdal Shelah v'ni. Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. Ki omar pen yamus gamhu ke'echav. For he thought he too might die like his brothers. Vatelech Tamar vateshev beisaviha. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Verse 12, Vayirbu hayamim. A long time passed. Vatamas bas Shua eshes Yehuda. And Yehuda's wife, Shua's daughter, died. Vayinachem Yehuda. When Yehuda had completed his time of mourning and was comforted, Vayal al gozazet sono, hu v'chira reyehu ha'adulami timnasa. He and his neighbor Chira, the Adulami, went to join his sheep shearers in Timnah. Verse 13, Vayuga lesamar lemor. And Tamar was told, Hine chamich ole simnasa lagos sono. Your father-in-law is going to Timnah to shear his sheep. Verse 14, Vatasar bigdei almanusa me'aleha. So she took off her widow's clothing. Vatachas batsoif. And she covered herself with a veil. Vatisalaf. And she wrapped herself up. Vateshev befesach einayim asher al derech timnasa. And she sat at the entrance to Einayim on the road to Timnah. Or in other translations, she sat at the crossroads on the way to Timnah. Ki ra'asa ki gadal Shelah. Because she had seen that Shelah had now grown up. V'hi lo nitna lo la'isha. And yet she had not been given to him as a wife. So her plan was to confront Yehuda about this and to either get herself married off to Shelah or to have a child through Yehuda. Verse 15, Vayir'eha Yehuda, Vayachshaveha lezonah. Yehuda saw her and thought she was a prostitute, ki chisasa paneha, because she had covered her face, which isn't the typical appearance a person might associate with a prostitute. Nevertheless, verse 16, Vayet eleha el haderech. So he went towards her in her direction, Vayomer, and he said, Havana ava elayich. Come, if you please, let me be with you. Ki lo yada ki chalasohi. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. Vatomer, and she said, Ma titen li ki savo elai. What will you give me to sleep with you? Verse 17, Vayomer, and he said, Anochi ashalach gedi izim min hatzon. I will send you a young goat from my flock. Vatomer, and she said, Im titein eravon ad shalchecha. Only if you give me something as a pledge until you send it. Verse 18, Vayomer, and he said, Ma ha'eravon asher eten lach. What pledge should I give you? Vatomer, and she said, Chosamacha ufasilecha umatacha asher biadecha. Your signet ring, your wrap, and your staff that is in your hand, which are all things that would clearly identify Yehuda as the owner. Vayiten la, and he gave them to her. Vayavo eleha vatahar lo, and he consorted with her, and she became pregnant by him. Verse 19, Vatakam vatelech vatasar tzeifa me'aleha. She got up and left, removed her veil, vatilbash bigdei al manusa, and put on her widow's clothes again. Verse 20, Vayishlach Yehuda es gedi ha'ezim biyad re'ehu ha'adulami. Yehuda sent the young goat with his neighbor, the Adulami, lakachas ha'eravon miyad ha'isha, to recover the pledge from the woman. V'lo matza'ah, but he could not find her. Verse 21, Vayishal es anshe mekomah. And he asked the local men, Lemor, saying, Hayeh hakteshahi va'inayim al hadarech. Where is the prostitute, the one by the crossroads, along the way? Vayomeru, and they said, Lo haisava zekadesha. There was no prostitute here. And very interestingly, the Hebrew word used here by the Torah for a prostitute is a kadesha, which shares a root in the word kadosh, holiness. And there are fascinating reasons and connections between all of these different words. Kiddush on a Friday night, on a Shabbat. Kadosh, holiness. Kadesha, a prostitute. Kiddushin, the act of Kiddushin as it regards to a marriage. There are some very interesting links. Verse 22, Vayashav el Yehuda, he came back to Yehuda. Vayomer lo mitzasiha, and he said, I could not find her. V'gam anshe hamakom amru, and also the locals said, lo haisav haseh kadesha, that there was no prostitute there at all. Verse 23, Vayome Yehuda, the Yehuda said, Tikachla pen nihye lavuz. Let her keep what she has, or we will become embarrassed. We will become a laughing stock. Hine shalachti hagadi hazeh. I tried to send her this young goat, va'ata lo matzasa, but you could not find her. Verse 24, Vayihi kamishlosh chadashim. After about 3 months, Vayugad lihuda lemor, it was told to Yehuda saying, Zansa tamar kalasecha, your daughter-in-law Tamar has been unfaithful. V'gam hinei hara liznunim. In fact, she has become pregnant on account of her harlotry. Vayomi Yehuda hotziyuha v'sisaref. And Yehuda said, take her out and let her be burnt. And it's not entirely clear if he is sentencing her to death with this, or whether he was sentencing her to some other punishment, where it seems historically prostitutes would be branded in some way. Verse 25, Himutses, as she was being brought out, V'hishalcha el chamiha lemor. She sent her father-in-law, Yehuda, a message saying, Leish asher eile lo anochi hara. I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong. Vatomer, and she said, Hakerna lemi hachosemes v'hapsilim v'hamateh ha'ele. Please identify to whom this signet and this wrap and this staff belong. Verse 25, Vayaker Yehuda. Yehuda recognized them. Of course he did, he owned them. Vayomer, and he said, Tzadka mimeni. She is more righteous than I. Ki al kain lo nesatiha l'shela v'ni. It was because I did not give her to Shelah my son. V'lo yosaf od l'da'ata. And he was not intimate with her anymore. So in this verse, we see Yehuda taking a very brave step of taking accountability and responsibility for what he had done and what he had caused. He could have very easily turned the other way and denied any involvement, and instead he does the right thing. And this is seen as a turning point in Yehuda's journey as establishing himself as a person of great integrity and a person who can be a suitable leader and role model. Verse 27, Vayihi ba'es lidata, when the time came for her to give birth, v'hinei sa'omim b'vitna, there were twins in her womb. Verse 28, Vayihi b'lidata vayiten yad, as she was in labor, one child put out a hand. Vatikach hamialedes, vatikshor al yado shani, and the midwife took a crimson thread and tied it to his hand, lemor, saying, Ze yatsa rishona, this one came out first. Verse 29, Vayihi kameshiv yado, but he pulled his hand back in, v'hinei yatsa achiv, and his brother came out. Vatomer, and she said, Ma paratzta alecha paretz, how you have burst through. Vayikra shemo paretz, so he was named Peretz. And finally, verse 30, Va'achar yatsa achiv, afterwards his brother came out, Asher al yado hashani, who had the crimson thread on his hand, Vayikra shemo Zarach, and his name was Zerach. And Peretz indeed will go on to produce the lineage that leads to David HaMelech, that leads to King David, and ultimately to Mashiach. And so it's very interesting to take note of the fact that despite this very rocky start to Peretz's conception, you can nevertheless produce a royal lineage. And in fact, we saw the same thing with Lot and his daughters after they had run away from Sodom. where the incestuous relationship that he had with his daughter led to a child being born who they called Moab. And that child, Moab, would go on to be the ancestor of Ruth. And you find in the story of Ruth that she eventually marries Boaz. So you have Ruth, who is descended from Moab, Boaz, who is descended from Peretz in this chapter, and they go on to produce the lineage that leads to King David. Leadership, it seems, does not mean that a child has to be born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In fact, some of our greatest leaders have got very big skeletons in their closet. So that's all for chapter 38. As we turn to chapter 39 next time, we will get back to the story of Joseph in Egypt, the story of him and his time in the home of Potiphar, and eventually we will see him being thrown into prison. I look forward to learning that chapter with you. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.